They said Berlin in April 1945 was the moment the war ended. In truth, it was the moment a new one began. Behind the smoke of the last artillery barrages, and behind the cheers of the victory photographs, a quieter, more decisive skirmish started to unfold. The race to capture the information capital of the Third Reich, and to deny it, quietly, to the coming Soviet ally turned adversary. Few outside the small rooms of London's Broadway buildings or OSS Washington understand how fast the world pivoted inside those weeks between VE Day and the fall of summer 1945. The most valuable war material left in Germany was not tanks or factories. It was paper, millions of index cards, prisoner files, radio logs, cipher pads, Abwehr traffic summaries, linguist rosters, cryptologic crib sheets, and interrogation notes. The public record remembers D-Day and Arnhem. Less remembered is that while British XXX Corps was still fighting around the Dutch Mars in late March 1945, small detachments from SIS Section 5 and the American OSS X-2 branch were formally tasked to identify target lists for exploitation of German signal services, the TICOM, Mission, Target Intelligence Committee. These were not muscular infantry formations. These were linguists, record clerks, shorthand typists, data interpreters, and the uncomfortable, quiet technicians of the Army Security Agency, ASA, who understood that radio logs and dusty card indexes might shape the next 30 years more than the fall of the Reichstag dome. In Bavaria, US 7th Army's 36th Infantry Division, the Texas T-Patch Division, protected truck convoys not carrying valuables of gold but crates of punched Hollerith cards from OKWII in Starnberg and Bad Aibling. RAF 6th Squadron, the Dam Busters, was still flying when the British Foreign Office was already debating how to partition captured SIGINT spoils with the Americans, because Moscow could not be allowed to have it all. In this unusual moment, the British and Americans stood together, but their shared horizon was shifting. They already suspected the Soviets were not a peacetime ally. They were a future intelligence adversary. A diary entry from one of the junior civilian cryptanalysts attached to TICOM Team 6, dated 12 May 1945, reads simply, "The war is over. Now the real war begins." That sentence, unclassified decades later, is now seen as prophetic. In OSS transition mission offices in Berlin-Dahlem, the vibe was surreal. The Red Army was still physically present, occasionally sharing vodka across the rubble of ruined courtyards. Yet even now, both sides took photographs of the same filing cabinets only after windows were closed and typewriters were unplugged. Captured Abwehr veterans noted the sudden change in tone. The interrogations in Camp King near Oberursel in Hessen were not about V-2 rockets or past battle orders. They were about Soviet tradecraft, NKGB liaison desks in Smolensk, the transit stations of code material, and Soviet penetration protocols in Warsaw pre-1939. The British case officers appeared to know exactly what to ask, as though they already believed Soviet infiltration of Western ministries was real. They were not asking questions that the newspapers were asking. They were asking questions for the world that was coming next. Inside this strange twilight, a mid-tier British G2 courier, unknown then, unremarkable in record, found his opening. He carried forms, sealed envelopes, transit slips, and the most valuable item of all: preliminary inventory lists of what was captured, what was categorized, what was copied, and what was not. He was not making decisions. He was merely the bloodstream between cipher huts, document receiving rooms, and analytic desks. He knew who wanted which fragment. He saw which intercept summaries were routed to Arlington Hall and which were quietly returned to London. He understood, from the inside, what was important data and what was scrap. He would be the spy who sold secrets to both sides. And in this moment, in mid-1945, when SIS case officers and OSS analysts were both still, wearing the uniforms of wartime, but speaking already in the grammar of a coming ideological rivalry, the courier entered the world's most dangerous phase, the phase when no one was paying attention because victory banners were still hanging in the breeze. The courier recognized what almost no one else did. There was a market forming, and unlike Berlin's black market for coffee and cigarettes, this market traded in ambiguity. Who possessed which document and when would determine the analytic future of the next enemy. the USSR. The war courier decided not to pick a side. He decided to serve both. Part 2 waits directly on the horizon when Berlin's open rubble becomes a city of dead drops, air corridors, and mirrored loyalties, and when one man begins to refine the craft of selling identical secrets twice. Berlin, 1946, is a city where everything can be bought, except certainty. The Red Army stands in half the streets. British MPs and American MPs patrol the other half. But the most valuable product being traded is not bread, coal, or black market penicillin. It is the fragments of paper that escaped the fires of May, 1945, and into this shattered urban maze steps one man who understands the strange new reality faster than nearly anyone else. The mid-level G2 courier assigned to the Anglo-American Tycom exploitation chain. His badge is ordinary. His desk assignments are routine, but the job gives him something no colonel, no general, no minister has in this moment. Uncontrolled transit. He becomes the man who physically moves the envelopes. He hand-carries lists of captured German cipher machines to the Air Ministry at Whitehall. He escorts bundles of Abwehr traffic summaries to Arlington Hall's Berlin team in Dahlem. He transports index card packets of call sign cross-references from Bad Aibling to the British Berlin mission near the Tiergarten. No one checks the carrier, they check the seal. And so, the least important man in the room sees the most important thing. This city is a switching yard of intelligence traffic, and he is the switchman. Berlin's broken postal network becomes a map of opportunity. Collapsed tram viaducts over the S-Bahn rails become makeshift shelter for dead-drop tubes wrapped in rainproof American waxed ration paper, a heap of pulverized stone outside the burned shell of the Reich Aviation. Ministry becomes a meeting point for a Soviet residentura. Cutout, who uses the alias Anton. The courier uses worthless Reichsmarks for show, but the real payment is cigarettes, American Pall Malls, British players, occasionally a single tin of American penicillin. Soft currency more stable than any printed money in the city. The sums aren't huge. That is why he's invisible. The numbers are small enough not to alarm his own paymasters, but frequent enough that he begins to cultivate the subtle rhythm of a man with his own invisible accounting system. London suspects minor pilfering, but only as simple black market scrounging. No one yet sees that what he's skimming is not material. It's metadata. He memorizes which captured Luftwaffe radio call signs are being prioritized by the ASA signals team at Tempelhof. He notes which Wehrmacht cipher crib sheets are copied A priority to Washington and which are B priority to Cheltenham. He sees, in real time, how the West is already modeling Soviet force posture based on German historical reporting. And so he forms the most profitable and most dangerous realization of the early Cold War. Much of the West's picture of the Red Army comes from old German traffic analysis. If he can manipulate the supply of those fragments, he can manipulate the West's view of the East. A recovered fragment from his personal notebook, seized decades later in a British counter-espionage, purge and partially declassified, shows a small, chilling scrawl dated 2nd February 1947, roughly the moment the US Army Security Agency formally stood up its Soviet analysis branch. 2 customers, identical product. They assume exclusivity. I can sell mirror reflections. That single sentence is his entire business model. And Berlin, divided, starving, desperate, is the only city in Europe where such a model can survive more than a week. The Soviets think they've recruited a desperate go-between. The British think they're exploiting a harmless opportunist. Neither realizes he is already selling the same captured Wehrmacht call sign crib sheets twice. Once to the NKGB sector HQ hidden behind an unmarked door at the Adlerhof Hotel in the Soviet sector, and once to a senior MI5D branch liaison officer who believes the courier's Berlin walk-ins are merely discarded Luftwaffe fragments, collected from old men trading uniform, buttons for soap. The courier's genius is not in the theft, it is in the silence. He adds nothing. He changes nothing. He merely adjusts timing. He delays one envelope for a day. He advances another envelope by 2 hours. He plants the idea that one fragment came from a newly discovered file carton instead of an already catalogued set. He understands that in this fragile post-war moment, when the Anglo-American SIGINT fusion has no established audit trail, the order of discovery is the insight itself. He now controls sequence, and in intelligence, sequence is narrative. The courier is not yet a double agent in the classic sense. He is something more primitive and more dangerous. A man who has noticed the West is thinking about the Soviets through the eyes of defeated German analysts, and so he weaponizes the archive itself. The next step, part 3, will be his decisive escalation. The moment when Berlin becomes blockaded, when the air corridors become the only lifeline into West Berlin, and when he begins to sell the same traffic analysis crib sheet to both MI5 and Moscow, as though each were his one and only exclusive buyer. The Berlin blockade was the most photographed, non-shooting confrontation of the early Cold War. C-47s stacked in the sky, tail to nose, like beads on an invisible rosary. But inside the numbers, inside the telemetry, inside the post-strike radio logs, history still contains a thread that is not stamped in any official minute paper. While West Berlin was being kept alive on powdered milk and coal briquettes flown through the RAF Gatow corridor, one anonymous courier was manipulating Abwehr crib sheets in the shadows, selling the same page twice, and both clients believed they were his only customer. Summer 1948. Soviet NKGB Residentura officers at the Adlerhof Hotel, a shabby, plaster-patched building in the Soviet sector, begin paying small, careful increments for legacy Luftwaffe cross-feed. They are told, convincingly, that these are British-held intercept fragments from 1944 to 45, not yet inventoried by Arlington Hall. It is a brilliant line. The courier never claims access to active Soviet material. He claims access to old German indexing that the West hasn't finished sorting. The Soviets see no contradiction. They believe the courier is offering the drip feed of a chaotic archive that the British and Americans have only partially skimmed. It's almost believable, because it's true. The archive is chaotic, the metadata is messy, and the value of a single crib sheet, a single table of historical call sign, aliases, can distort how an analyst models modern Soviet order of battle. On the other side of the city, literally separated by rubble and ideology, a mid-grade MI5D branch liaison officer, assigned to the British Berlin mission, is paying the courier for the same material, except the courier labels it differently. To London, it is recovered Abwehr Type R index cards, potentially relevant to GAF 4th Air Fleet pre-Kursk tasking. Same content, same paper, 2 invoices, 2 completely separate glosses. Inside Arlington Hall's outstation in the American zone, the analytic struggle is painfully clear. ASA analysts want to build reasonably bounded assumptions on Soviet bomber strength. They ask a deceptively simple question. How many airfields in Soviet-controlled Eastern Germany are being primed for medium bomber dispersal? To answer that question, they lean, in part, on old German 1943-44 analysis of Soviet airfield throughput. That data has gaps. Those gaps are filled, partially, by the courier's double-soled fragments. This is the invisible hinge. One Abwehr crib sheet might list a Soviet GCI sector call sign with 2 alternate aliases. If MI5 gets that sheet on Monday, but NKGB gets it on Wednesday, then London believes it was discovered, first, by the West. If Moscow gets it on Monday, but London buys it on Wednesday, then the Soviets believe they hold the upper hand in analytic recency. The courier does not forge. He does not manufacture. He trades in chronology. Time, not paper, is his contraband. A former RAF Dakota, Captain Flying the Corridor, later wrote in his personal notebook, archived at Kew, "I do not know what was more dangerous, the weather or the ambiguity." He meant crosswinds and ice, but the metaphor fits the intelligence picture. Berlin was a city where everything was provisional, contingent, and reversible. No one could fully isolate signal from noise. And so, the courier steps into the void, not by adding new noise, but by shifting the timestamps on the signal. And to the NKGB, the Adlerhof liaison sees a pattern he can exploit. The West appears, from the Soviet perspective, to be constantly behind on identifying Red Air Force retasking indicators. Why? Because the courier delays the relevant crib sheet by a day. Moscow gets the first look, London gets the second look, and never knows. Meanwhile, on the Western side, MI5 believes it has exclusive, private walk-in access to fragments from old Luftwaffe signals, caches in Charlottenburg and Dahlem. Why? Because the courier advances the Western delivery by a day. London gets the same crib sheet first. Moscow gets it second. Both sides see a statistical reinforcement loop. They are slightly more informed than the adversary. They have slightly better signal than the adversary. They have slightly more timely call sign alias tables than the adversary. Both sides think they are winning the analytic race. Neither sees the loop as synthetic. This is the most dangerous form of double agency. Not active deception, but mutual confirmation of a false analytic edge. A US Army analyst in Dahlem will later write in a marginalia note, "There is a phantom operator in this file." He meant a missing German cryptologist, but the line lands like an omen. The entire analytic ecosystem, during the Berlin airlift, is being tuned by a man who is not choosing sides at all. He is choosing symmetry. And in the autumn of 1948, as RAF Hastings and US C-54s begin their relentless coal sorties, the Courier measures his success not in money, but in proof. Both clients think they are the one he trusts more. Part 4 will be the moment when Venona begins to flicker to life, and when the first real analytic ghost appears. Not in Berlin, but inside the codebooks of Washington and London themselves. A statistical ghost is the most boring pattern in the world, until it isn't. The breakthrough that would later be called Venona production did not begin as heroics. It began as arithmetic. Arlington Hall in 1949 is not a cinematic bunker of cigarette smoke and ticking bomb timers. It is fluorescent lights, sharpened pencils, desk blotters, and low-grade headaches from staring at Soviet one-time pad recurrences that should not mathematically have existed. That is the real trigger point of Part 4. The moment when pattern stops being clerical and begins being counter-espionage. By mid-1949, selected Venona pairs start moving into analytic production. The British do not receive full take, but they get samples through the SIS-ASA exchange pipeline. At first, the material is astonishingly subtle. Not decoded sentences, but meta-signals, timing overlaps, duplicate message headers, small phrasing anomalies in KGB traffic between New York, Ottawa, and Moscow. The United States is not yet sharing the deepest keys, but the UK begins to see enough to ask a frightening question. Why do fragments of captured Abwehr exploitation appear twice in the Anglo-American Analytic Repository, once as German WWII legacy, and once as Soviet tradecraft reference? That should not be possible. Abwehr. Paperwork was seized in 1945. Soviet traffic in Venona is late 1940s. There should be no naturally occurring symmetric echo. Yet the echo is there, faint, but there. Two separate statistical analysts. The names remain redacted in the Venona release box series. KV2 files even today independently flag the same anomaly. Some of the Luftwaffe call sign alias tables used by the Soviets in post-war KGB traffic are bit for bit identical to the Abwehr alias crib sheets, still inside the Allied Berlin exploitation trace. That means something very simple and very lethal. Someone sold the Allies' newly discovered Abwehr crib sheets directly to the Soviets. SIS does not panic. ASA does not panic. There is a far more terrifying first reaction. We need to be absolutely certain before we destroy the reputation of an ally. So they decide to open a joint inquiry, quietly, with no arrest threshold. They do not want to trigger political oxygen. They do not want Parliament or Congress involved. They want to see if the echo continues for 90 days. That inquiry becomes the silent hinge of the courier's life. He senses the pressure. He has no access to Venona, but he sees the symptom elsewhere. Envelopes that used to bypass signature registers now require two countersigns. Coded traffic allocations that once moved in brown envelopes now move under separate cover. London requests backdated enumeration lists of all Luftwaffe archival fragments provided to Arlington Hall between April 1946 and October 1947. That request only means one thing. Someone is reconstructing timing, and the courier made his living in timing. He reacts instantly. First, he burns two fallback addresses, literally, using a captured Wehrmacht field stove in a ruined cellar he uses as a staging point. Second, he cuts contact with his Soviet liaison Anton for 21 days, long enough to make it look like post-blockade routine movement disruption. Third, he files a formal reassignment request, ostensibly to broaden his career, to shape liaison duty, Because NATO integration talks are beginning to shape the earliest form of Allied command design, SHAPE does not even exist officially yet. It will be formalized in 1951, but the idea exists by mid-1949, and the courier wants to disappear into that idea. What makes this moment so suspenseful is not an explosion or a gunshot, but the absence of arrest, because in a strange double bind, MI5 and ASA leadership agree on one principle. We cannot make a public case if the suspect is not fully known by name. A false accusation could blow up the entire Anglo-American fusion mechanism before it has even matured, so they do nothing outwardly. They watch one more quarter, and the courier, realizing he is living on borrowed time inside an analytic system that is beginning to make the invisible visible, makes his most dangerous move. He stops selling the Soviet side new material. He pauses one of the two channels. He chooses to starve one side strategically, so he can wait and see whether the Western analytic suspicion is coming from London or Moscow. He wants to see which echo collapses first. That is where part 4 ends, a suspended breath. The courier understanding that statistical ghosts have begun to burn light around him. In part 5, the Korean War will detonate the world again, and the courier will take his greatest gamble, attempting to correct his own analytic signature, not with silence, but by selling Soviet-doctored GCI returns back to London to camouflage his treachery. When the Korean War detonates in June 1950, Washington's analytic horizon snaps away from Berlin's rubble and pivots toward the 38th parallel. But the logic of signals intelligence does not shift continents so cleanly. The same analysts who once speculated over Soviet bomber dispersal at Verneuchen and Fino now begin feeding numbers into joint intelligence. Committee drafts on potential Tu-4 forward range arcs if Moscow were to backstop Pyongyang. And into this frantic scramble, into this renewed emergency, the courier re-enters the battlefield in silence. He sees one thing no one else sees. The world of hurry creates the world of error. And in error he can hide. He has spent nearly a full year starving one side. He has listened. He has waited. He can't see Venona, but he can feel its gravitational pull. Tighter seals, more paperwork, double-signed transit tallies, the growing existence of a second ledger inside the MI5 Berlin mission that didn't exist in 1947. He concludes, correctly, that the pressure is coming from the West, not the East. So he tries a gambit no historian would believe if we didn't have partial documentary shadow of it. He tries to poison his own fingerprint. He resumes selling, carefully. But now the payloads are not archival German crib sheets. Now the payloads are Soviet doctorings of Soviet GCI. He begins feeding the Soviets' own manipulated reporting back to London, in microfragments, as if they were late-surfaced Luftwaffe Type R alias cards. And the effect is immediate and corrosive. RFE-lint long-range flights. 192 squadron detachments staging from Schleswigland. Routine Baltic racetracks have been accumulating GCI return fingerprints from Soviet PVO Strany radar nets. Those returns have quirks, distinctive lobe patterning. The Soviets know this. They know the British know this. They also know the British lack volume, lack confidence intervals, lack statistical depth. So Moscow feeds the courier very slightly incorrect lobe pattern data, deliberately shimmered, and he walks the same material into the British queue, as though it were merely one more dusty Luftwaffe. Draw someone found in a half-collapsed archive building in Steglitz to Moscow, he is obedient again. To London. He is a source of late-surfacing legacy crumbs. This is the most lethal form of disinformation, identity blurring. Bad data disguised as old data disguised as good data. A triple mask, and because it enters the West, not as Soviet modern intercept, but as German WWII historical cross-reference, the contamination hits where analysts are most vulnerable. Priors. It is the priors that get compromised. Old Luftwaffe crib sheets become the silent scaffolding upon which Anglo-American order of battle assumptions stand. If the scaffolding is warped, the building looks stable right up until the moment it collapses. We know, from joint intelligence, committee drafts, that 3 bomber threat estimates in 1950-51 show consistent directional overreads on Tu-4 readiness in Soviet Baltic dispersal fields. Not insane deltas, not cartoons, 10% bumps, 12% bumps, 14% bumps. Those are exactly the plausible deltas that slip through analytic skepticism. Too small to be scandal, too big to be noise. In the narrative of public Cold War history, the Korean War is jets, tank battles, Truman firing MacArthur. In the narrative of signals intelligence, it is quieter. It is the year the courier transitions from double seller to analytic sculptor. He is no longer merely selling identical secrets. To both sides, he is now manipulating the shape of the West's analytic belief about Soviet early bomber readiness. He is sculpting the expectation of a threat. He does not need the Soviets to do anything. He simply needs the West to fear something a little more than they otherwise would. And he's almost invisible again. Almost, because late 1950 is also the moment when MI5 begins receiving raw, the Nona light, not the heavy keys, not the deep decodes, but the analytic metadata, enough to see the double echo of Abwehr crib sheets repeated in Soviet channels. Not enough to name the courier, but enough to know the ghost has not gone dormant. The echo has not ceased. So the West sharpens its questions. The courier sees the sharpening, and so, in yet another attempt to stay ahead of his own detection, he reverts again to silence. He goes quiet. He stops feeding doctored Soviet Baltic GCI. He tries to freeze his own signature, the way a burglar might stand perfectly still, hoping the searchlights don't sweep quite that far. But the silence cannot hold forever. Because in 1951, on a routine passenger transfer flight, RAF Gatow to Fassberg, the courier simply disappears. No ramp, no customs queue, no body. Part 6 is the most uncomfortable zone historians hate because it gives no closure. The moment where the file ends, not with a confession, but with a blank manifest and a still classified British counter-intel summary. Possible double channel. Not resolved. There is a phrase that appears occasionally in the British files at Q, usually in pencil, sometimes underlined, operational scissors. It was an austere term of art from the 1940s-50s counter-intel lexicon. It meant a moment in which two investigative blades close at the same time, and a suspect vanishes, not because he escaped, but because the blades intersected. In 1951, this is precisely the geometry that surrounds the courier's final appearance. There is no melodrama in the official record. There's no gunshot, no intercepted note, no final radio call. There is only one RAF airport, one passenger movement table, one man who checks onto a transfer flight. RAF Gatow in Berlin and bound to Fassberg in the British zone, and never checks off. And that blank is the most frightening line of the entire story. The flight in question, a short-haul RAF transport, is typical of the post-blockade British Berlin airlift infrastructure. Even after Stalin lifts the blockade in May 1949, Berlin remains an island in Soviet territory. British air corridors remain the artery of life. Berlin, Hamburg, Berlin, Hanover, Berlin, Fassberg. The flight tracks are routine. The courier has travelled them before. Ground crew recall nothing odd. He boards the aircraft with two others, both routine liaison passengers, and one RAF loadmaster. The flight departs. The weather logs show moderate haze, but no diversion. Fassberg receives and logs the wheels down time. The two other passengers disembark. The loadmaster signs the manifest. The courier does not appear. There is no notation that he was medically removed. There is no notation of emergency exit. The simplest version is the most impossible. He was there, and then he wasn't. Within 72 hours, MI5's Berlin mission drafts a private memorandum, not for Parliament, not for the Foreign Office, but for a tiny ring of counter-intel readers, summarizing what can be said without causing political damage. Source may have exfiltrated, unknown vector, unknown actor. An identical version exists in US Army Security Agency Berlin station logs. Probable disappearance. Do not formalize finding. There is no request for public pursuit. There is no police circular. The absence of panic is its own indictment, because both London and Washington understand what a public scandal would do to Anglo-American analytic fusion. Venona is still young. The Soviet target problem is maturing. Accusing the wrong man, or accusing too loudly, could fracture the co-production agreement that keeps Soviet analytic access flowing both ways across the Atlantic. So there is silence. Several historians, in the small, specialized world of Cold War signals historiography, subscribe to one hypothesis: Soviet extraction. They point to the canal infrastructure east of Grunau, the industrial zone where NKGB had utilities cover. Barges move at night. Berlin's ruins are still porous. It would not be difficult, in that era, to take a single man off a manifest and move him 2 kilometers into the Soviet sector before the British even realized they should ring the bell. Other historians subscribe to a darker Western hypothesis that MI5 allowed the disappearance to occur, not as punishment, but as containment. The logic here is not fantastical. In early 1951, before the world knows Venona as a codename of power, it is still merely an analytic indicator. It is not prosecutorial. It is not courtroom grade. If MI5 names the wrong man, they destroy their own credibility. If they name no one, they preserve the institutional future. Silence is a tool. Silence is a shield. Silence keeps the mechanism alive. There is another note, almost trivial, but it chills the professional reader. One of the Berlin mission scribes, a desk officer who later left government, wrote in his private notebook, "The most dangerous spy is the one who is only partly discovered." It is a sentence that appears to have been written in frustration, not philosophy, but it maps the problem perfectly. The courier is never fully known. There is never a full ledger. There is never a full chain of custody. There is only echo and absence, and the vanishing of a silhouette who lived in temporal. Manipulation rather than spectacular. Theft, his case file, declassified in fragments, is not titled double agent. It is titled possible double channel. The word possible is the indictment. The word channel is the confession. This is where the documentary lens must freeze on a frame that has no recorded coda. A hallway at RAF Gartow, a clipboard with 3 names, and only 2 signatures at the airfield on the other. End. Power in intelligence is sometimes not the possession of secrets, but the timing of secrets. His true legacy is not in what he stole, but in what he made both superpowers believe they knew ahead of the other. The spy who sold secrets to both sides. A Cold War thriller ends here, not with arrest, not with exposure, but with absence. The blade closes, the file does not.